kick off.
Hello, I am Mrs. Y. Perumal, and today I'm going to teach the first lesson on genetics, which is a grade 12 life science topic. This topic belongs to paper 2 and it carries 45 marks. All Mountview secondary learners are to download my notes and copy these notes into your paper 2 book. So today's lesson comprises of 8 concepts, and for each concept I'm going to name it, explain it, and use additional diagrams and additional notes and diagrams to explain the concept further. The first one is chromatin network. What is chromatin network? It's a tangled mass of genetic material found in the nucleus of a cell. If this were to represent a cell, this would be the cell membrane, which encloses everything within. This would be the organelle called the nucleus, and the nuclear membrane would enclose everything within, including the nucleolus, the nucleoplasm, and the chromatin network. If I were to isolate one strand from this chromatin network, it would really be a single-stranded chromosome, which is made up of a DNA molecule. The next concept is chromosome. During the cell cycle, one of the phases is interphase. During interphase, the DNA molecule makes an identical copy of itself. This process is called DNA replication. And during this process, each single-stranded chromosome becomes double-stranded. If you look at this diagram, there is a chromatin material, and this represents a single-stranded chromosome. After DNA replication, since the DNA makes an identical copy of itself, and this since a single-stranded chromosome is made up of a DNA molecule, the single-stranded chromosome becomes double-stranded like this. This is a double-stranded chromosome which is made up of 2 identical strands called chromatids. So there's a chromatid and there's its identical copy, another chromatid. Each is really a DNA molecule, and there's the identical copy of that same DNA molecule. The 2 chromatids are joined at this point, which is called the centromere. The next concept I want to discuss is a gene. What is a gene? A gene is a small portion or segment or particular length of a DNA which is found at a particular location, which we refer to as a locus on a chromosome. And this portion of DNA influences or codes for or controls a particular characteristic. For example, if this represents a single-stranded chromosome, then if this is the gene which codes for eye color, what is it really made up of? It's made up of a segment of a DNA molecule. This is the DNA molecule which I have drawn so that it is stretched out. Then the next segment of the DNA molecule could be this piece here, and it does not code for any characteristic. Therefore, we cannot call it a gene, we call it non-coding DNA. The next segment could represent this gene, which could code for example, the shape of the ear. The next concept I'm going to discuss is the allele. What is an allele? Alleles are different forms of a gene or alternate forms of a gene which occur at the same position called locus on homologous chromosomes. For example, if this is a pair of single-stranded homologous chromosomes, then this allele and this allele are actually different forms of this single gene. These two alleles make up a single gene which controls the characteristic of height in pea plants. Each allele is represented by a letter. For example, this allele is represented by capital letter T because it codes for tallness in the pea plant, and this allele is represented by the small letter t because it codes for shortness in the pea plant. So these alleles are actually different forms or alternate forms of the same gene. It's one gene which is made up of two alleles. The next concept is genotype. What does the word genotype mean? G for genotype, G for genetic makeup or genetic composition. So genotype refers to the genetic composition or makeup of an organism or individual, such as a dog, a cat, a plant, a person, for a particular characteristic. For example, if these are the two, if we look at this chromosome pair, what is the genotype of this pea plant for height? And the genotype would actually represent the two alleles for that particular gene, and the genotype would be written as capital T and small t. What is the genotype of a plant if its two alleles are capital T and capital T? In other words, these two alleles are identical and they both code for tallness in the plant. Answer: capital T, capital T. So in genotype, we are really representing the two alleles which are found on homologous chromosomes. The next concept is phenotype. What does the word phenotype mean? P for phenotype, P for physical. Phenotype is the physical outward appearance of an organism, which is determined by its genotype. So let's go to this plant. If this is the homologous pair of chromosomes for the characteristic of height, what would the phenotype for this plant be? And the answer would be tall. This plant would appear tall. Another example, if the genotype for a particular plant is capital T and small t, what would the plant look like? In other words, what is its physical outward appearance? And the answer is tall. I know you are wondering why tall. Now I'm going to discuss the dominant allele and the recessive allele, and that will explain why I've got a capital letter T and a small letter t for this set of alleles for this particular gene. Okay, our last two terms are dominant allele and recessive allele. What is the definition of a dominant allele? A dominant allele is expressed or shown in the phenotype of an individual when it's found in the heterozygous, for example, capital T, small t, and in the homozygous, example, capital T, conditions. When we talk about heterozygous, we mean that the two alleles which code for a particular characteristic are different. For example, this allele codes for tallness in pea plants, and this small letter t represents the allele which codes for shortness. So this individual is heterozygous, and this individual is homozygous. Homo means the same. Zygous refers to zygote, the individual. So this individual is homozygous because it has two identical alleles for the characteristic of height. So let's go back. What do we mean by dominant allele? A dominant allele is always expressed when it is in the heterozygous condition and in the homozygous condition. But the more clear understanding of dominant allele is when it is found in the heterozygous condition. In other words, when it is found in combination with another recessive allele. The dominant allele masks or blocks the expression of the recessive allele. Let's go to this example. With this pair of homologous chromosomes, both the alleles are identical. So the individual is said to be homozygous. Since both the alleles are dominant, the individual is said to be homozygous dominant for height, the characteristic of height. So what is the genotype? Capital T, capital T. The phenotype would be, since both the alleles are dominant, both the alleles would be expressed in the phenotype, and that plant would look tall. However, if this dominant allele is in combination with a recessive allele, the recessive allele will not be able to express itself in the phenotype of the plant. Only the dominant allele would be able to express itself in the phenotype of the plant. And so therefore the individual is said to be heterozygous because it's got two different alleles coding for the characteristic of height, and the genotype would be representing the two alleles, the capital T for the allele which codes for tallness, and the small letter t would represent the allele coding for shortness. It's always found in twos because we are referring to alleles found on homologous chromosomes which are found in pairs. And the phenotype would be tall. Why would the phenotype be tall? Because this allele which codes for tallness is a dominant allele, and it would mask or block the expression of this allele which codes for shortness. And how do we write them? We write the capital letter after the dominant allele, so T for tall, and the recessive allele is represented by a small letter t, and even though it codes for a short plant, we don't write S, we write the small letter t because it is recessive to the allele which codes for tallness. The last concept is a recessive allele. What is a recessive allele? It is an allele that is masked or not expressed in the phenotype when it is in the heterozygous condition. In other words, when it is in combination with a dominant allele. However, the recessive allele can be expressed. Question: when can it be expressed? The recessive allele can only be expressed in an individual when the individual is said to be homozygous or pure breeding. In other words, both alleles have to be recessive. So this individual is said to be homozygous because both alleles are identical. It's homozygous recessive because both the alleles are recessive to the dominant allele which codes for tallness. What will the genotype be? To represent the two alleles, we write a small letter t and a small letter t. This allele codes for shortness and this allele codes for shortness. What would the phenotype be? Since both alleles are not in combination with a dominant allele, since both alleles are identical and both code for shortness, the individual would appear short. In other words, a plant would appear short. Thank you very much.